Mexico is the deadliest country for the environmentalists across the globe. In 2021 alone, at least 54 environmental defenders were killed there, with some estimates placing the total closer to 200. So why is Mexico so dangerous for environmental activists? In this video, we'll explore how this wave of violence isn't random. It reflects deeper political and economic structures within Mexico. We'll examine the country's weak state capacity, its process of nation building, the effects of neoliberal economic policies and extractivism, and its history of authoritarian regimes and democratic transition. Understanding how these systems work and who they work for helps us understand not only the violence, but the urgent need for structural change. Let's take a closer look at what's really happening in Mexico. State capacity refers to a government's ability to implement policies, maintain order, and provide public services. In Latin America, and Mexico specifically, state capacity has often been limited. Corruption, weak institutions, and decentralized power structures contribute to this weakness. According to Luna and Monk, weak states struggle to enforce laws and protect vulnerable populations. In Mexico, this has dire consequences for environmental defenders. Reports indicate that local authorities are implicated in approximately 40% of environmental activist killings. This suggests not just negligence but active participation in suppressing dissent. Patrimonialism is a system where state resources are treated as personal property by those in power. In Mexico, the Institutional Revolutionary Party maintained control for over 70 years through clientelism and patronage. This blurred the lines between public service and personal gain. Even after democratization efforts, the remnants of patrimonialism persist. Local elites often wield significant power without accountability, leading to the exploitation of natural resources and suppression of environmental activism. The 1982 debt crisis prompted Mexico to adopt neoliberal economic policies, emphasizing free markets, privatization, and reduced state intervention. While initially boosting economic growth, these reforms weakened the state's regulatory capacity. Private interests gained greater influence, often at the expense of environmental protections. Decentralization further complicated governance, allowing local authorities to act with minimal oversight. This environment has facilitated the exploitation of natural resources and increased risks for environmental defenders. Nation building involves defining who belongs to the nation and who does not. To understand this violence, we also have to ask, who does the state seek to protect as part of the nation? National identity isn't always written in law. It's expressed in who the state chooses to protect, whose voices are heard, and who is allowed to belong. While indigenous communities in Mexico may hold formal citizenship, they are often excluded from the state's protection and national imagination. From the late 1980s and 1990s, neoliberal reforms meant the adoption of free markets, privatizing state industries, reducing trade barriers, and attracting foreign investment. In this framework, forests, rivers, and minerals are treated as commodities, available to the highest bidder. So when indigenous communities oppose mining, logging, and energy projects aren't just defending their land but opposing economic development and modernization. While neoliberalism and democracy can lead to greater freedoms, weak states have a harder time implementing policies, even when the implementation leads to greater democratic ideals. It seems that the powerful have greater access to what people have the right to say rather than the state. In weak states, where laws are selectively enforced, certain rights, like free speech, can exclude vulnerable citizens of the nation, making rights like free speech only available to the wealthy and powerful. Mexico's economy has increasingly relied on the extraction and export of natural resources, a model known as neo-extractivism. This approach prioritizes economic growth and foreign investment over environmental sustainability and social equity. Local and indigenous communities often bear the brunt of these projects, facing displacement and environmental degradation. Their opposition is frequently met with violence, as the state aligns with corporate interests. This dynamic underscores the intersection of economic policy and human rights violations. The current administration faces criticism for undermining checks and balances, raising concerns about democratic backsliding. Environmental defenders, in particular, continue to face threats without adequate protection, reflecting the state's ongoing struggle to uphold democratic principles and human rights. The plight of environmental defenders in Mexico is a multifaceted issue, rooted in historical, political, and economic complexities. Luna and Munich define a regime as a system of governance that determines the rules, structures, and institutions through which political power reigns in a territory. Regimes range can be democratic, authoritarian, or can be a hybrid of both. Mexico's modern political history is deeply shaped by decades of one-party rule under the Institutional Revolutionary Party. From the early 20th century through the late 1990s, the PRI maintained near-total control over the state through a system of centralized authority, patronage, and corporatist incorporation. Civil society groups, including labor unions, peasant organizations, and professional associations, were brought into the political system not through autonomy, but through controlled, class-based channels tied to the state. This model ensured political stability, but limited meaningful participation outside of state-sanctioned avenues. Independent activism, including environmental or indigenous resistance, had little room to flourish. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 1990s, Mexico initiated a transition toward democracy. Electoral reforms weakened PRI dominance, culminating in the historic 2000 election of the first non-PRI president in over 70 years. This moment marked a significant shift toward electoral democracy, where elections became freer and opposition parties gained real power. But democratization focused heavily on electoral procedures. It left many of the PRI-era structures, corruption, patronage, and weak rule of law, largely intact. As Luna and Monk explain, democratization requires more than elections. It demands institutional accountability, equal rights enforcement, and the capacity to protect vulnerable populations. In Mexico, these deeper reforms remain incomplete. This incomplete transition has direct consequences for environmental defenders. While the formal right to protest or speak out may exist, state protection is often absent, and violence continues with little consequence. Changing bases of political organization under PRI corporatism, class-based groups like labor and peasant unions were integrated into the state. But with the rise of neoliberal reforms in the 1980s and 1990s, privatization, deregulation, and the weakening of unions, these class-based connections unraveled. In their place, new bases of political organization emerged. Movements centered on gender, indigenous rights, the environment, and broader human rights issues began to grow. These groups operated outside of traditional party structures and often challenged the very economic and political models the state now prioritized. This shift created new space for activism, but also new risks. Without the formal protections that came with corporatist inclusion and facing a fragmented or weak state, these new actors are more exposed to violence and repression. Mexico's political evolution can't be separated from broader regional dynamics, especially the influence of the United States. During the Cold War, U.S. policy in Latin America often prioritized anti-communism over democratic principles. In countries like Chile and Guatemala, the U.S. directly supported the overthrow of democratically elected governments. In El Salvador and Nicaragua, it financed and armed anti-leftist factions. The level of intervention often depended on how aligned a regime was with U.S. interests and how much influence the U.S. could exert. Mexico, while never the site of a direct intervention, was still shaped by these dynamics. Rather than pushing for democratization, the U.S. prioritized trade alliances and regional stability, supporting Mexico's neoliberal transition through economic aid and agreements like NAFTA. These policies reinforced an economic model that favored privatization and foreign investment over grassroots democracy. In practice, this often meant more protection for capital than for communities. Mexico's economic development has long centered on an export-oriented model, especially since the mid-20th century. This approach, often called neo-extractivism, relies on the large-scale extraction and export of natural resources like oil, minerals, and timber. It's designed to attract foreign investment and drive economic growth. But, as Luna and Monk note in Chapter 13, this model frequently comes at the expense of environmental sustainability and social equity. Many of these extractive projects are located in indigenous and rural areas, where communities are displaced, ecosystems are disrupted, and decision-making rarely includes those directly affected. Extractive industries often operate with minimal accountability, and when local resistance arises, the state frequently aligns with corporate interests rather than defending those most vulnerable. These shifts also impacted socioeconomic welfare, which includes health, education, job security, and income. Although GDP has increased, the benefits of growth remain concentrated at the top. In many regions, especially rural and indigenous ones, inequality has only deepened. The idea of modernity in Latin America has long been associated with European ideals, industrialization, urbanization, and whiteness. Indigenous systems of land use and governance were often portrayed as backward or anti-development. As a result, national development efforts excluded indigenous communities, not only from the benefits of growth, but from the vision of the nation, a structure that has long prioritized extraction over inclusion and treated dissent as a threat to progress. The violence against environmental defenders in Mexico isn't just the result of weak enforcement or local corruption, it's the product of deeper structural forces. It reflects a state shaped by patrimonialism and uneven democratization, an economy built on extraction and exclusion, and a nation that has often defined progress through narrow, colonial ideas of modernity. Indigenous and rural communities aren't just fighting for land. They're fighting to be recognized, protected, and heard. Addressing this crisis requires more than new laws or policies. It means rethinking who the state serves, what development looks like, and whose voices define the future of the nation.